This word cooperation. Again, often a word I think taken for granted as something that we all engage in, but actually I think it's a problematic concept and a problematic term. In my very pessimistic moments, when nothing seems to be working in things you're doing and so forth, in my pessimistic moments, I sometimes think that no nation is capable of learning from another nation's mistakes, and that actually the only thing they learn from is their own mistakes, and that they somehow have to repeat the mistakes that others have made before they can learn the lessons themselves from those mistakes. If that's the case, what does cooperation mean? Can you actually help another country in various ways? So that's in my pessimistic moments. In my more optimistic moments, I think, yes, you can. Cooperation does have meaning, because ideas go beyond borders. Ideas travel from people to people, and people to people are not constrained by that matter. They talk to each other, they learn from each other. And even institutions can learn from each other. And ultimately, when you put the nations and the institutions and the people together, then the nations should be able to learn from each other. So I think in my more optimistic moments, though I still have, harbour some deep doubts, yes, let's work on cooperation. That there is some benefit to doing it, that we can actually achieve something. South-South implies that it's in contradistinction to North-South. So let's first start with North-South as a concept to look at. In one sense, a lot of the borrowing that's happened has been North-South. Why? Because of colonialism. So, I haven't actually done a study of this, and if there's an exception, please let me know about it. But basically, every colonial entity borrowed the form of democracy and the form of governance structure that its colonial master had. Presidential for the presidential colonialists, parliamentary for the parliamentary colonists, and so forth. So you see, in some places it's very stark. I'm a student of Indonesia, and when you look at the 1945 Indonesian Constitution, it has an explanatory memorandum that accompanies it. A lot of Dutch words in that memorandum, borrowing a lot of Dutch concepts and so forth. So it stands to reason that the colonial experiment, the colonial period, has led to a lot of borrowing of institutions and so forth, and that's an important part of North-South. And it was a sort of an element of colonialism. Having said that, we are in a period, the third wave of democracy that Huntington described, which, in my opinion, really only begins with the end of the Cold War. The third wave of democracy that I think started with the end of the Cold War has seen a period of great ferment and experimentation in designs of democratic institutions. And where has this experimentation taken place? In the Global South, not in the Global North. When Arendt Leibhardt did a study in 1990, so this is the actual cusp, this is the change from the Cold War period to the post-Cold War, when Leibhardt did a study of virtually every Western northern democracy, he found that in that period between the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, only one country had actually made an important change to its electoral system. There was no experimentation in institutional design in that period. This was, I think we can now look back on this as a period of stasis. And what it meant was you actually, in many ways, you deepened institutions. And you also maybe gave a lot of institutions more legitimacy, because one means of legitimacy is longevity. longevity is a means of creating legitimacy. And of course, it stands to reason it can't be done instantly. It's one of those ways that develop over time. And in that concept of, a lot of the Western institutions have their legitimacy based on longevity, it almost stands to reason that they cannot be borrowed as they are. North-South cooperation, clearly there's a lot that can happen, but it's not necessarily appropriate. South-South cooperation is a far more appropriate concept because the entities have all begun at a similar time and are learning in a similar way what they're doing. And so the examples from the South can therefore often be more applicable and more acceptable to various countries dealing with these issues. So let me just run through a few examples without drawing any sort of theoretical basis. A few examples of particular institutions that have flown from the global South and are particularly praiseworthy. Now, those that people mention are the Brazilian concept of participatory budgeting. Clearly something that has worked in Brazil and can travel. And it depends on whether or not a country wants to experiment in participatory budgeting, but it's an institution, I think, that is well worth the effort of cooperating on. The elaboration of constitutions dealing with a whole range of issues is something else that, although the concept of the Constitution is ancient and its modern practice flows from American and French experimentation again in the 18th century, the modern process of drafting constitutions is very much a global southern affair. With constitutional commissions, debating the process, public interest in it, public debates on the process, dealing with issues in far greater depth often than are dealt with in the older constitutions. Sometimes including concepts such as national aspirations as a goal. So these, the constitutional creation process is very much something that the Global South has contributed to in modern times. Judicial activism is something that I think South Africa and India in particular have developed, and the Philippines also has quite an active Supreme Court, have developed to a tremendous degree. Now, I studied law and practiced law for a number of years. It is horrifying to a Western-trained common lawyer to see the sort of judicial activism that goes on in places like India and South Africa and the Philippines, because, we believe it's a parliament that must write the laws and the courts have a much narrower role of interpreting them. But in the Global South and in these countries in particular, the courts have just taken responsibility and argued that, look, if Parliament wants this to happen, then we have to find ways of making these things happen, including what really is a form of sub-legislation and requiring governments to take all sorts of actions to especially have constitutional provisions come to light. So this sort of judicial activism is something that you will certainly not find in the Global North, but it is appropriate for the Global South if you have an independent judiciary. And judicial activism, of course, is nonsense if the judiciary is completely subservient to the executive branch. But even here, I think India has shown the way in that the Indian Supreme Court basically said an independent judiciary is the key to the success of rule of law in India, so we will decide who can become the judges, not you, politicians. And again, this is a very innovative idea. There are some others too. It's not as well known, but Thailand, when it drafted its 1997 constitution, went through an incredibly innovative process of thinking through the problems and looking for solutions. The problem that Thailand identified as holding back the nation was basically political corruption. Deep-seated corruption in the form of patronage and other processes. And to resolve this problem of political corruption, Thailand invented a fourth branch of government. And this is an oversight branch. A range of institutions, from new administrative courts and a new constitutional court, anti-corruption commissions, ombudsman's offices, electoral commissions with tremendous powers to disqualify candidates in mid-campaign, a whole range of issues like that. But what went wrong is the old Roman question, who will guard the guardians? Because this new fourth branch of government, of guardians, who will guard the guardians? Who will appoint them and oversight them and dismiss them? The answer that the Thai constitution gave was, again, a very innovative answer. A non-partisan Senate. Senate, which would not have any political party representatives, would be each person elected just on their merits, and the Senate would then be the institution that would guard the guardian. It didn't work. But the concept of a fourth branch of government is an innovative concept from the Global South. Let me give you two more examples of great ideas from the South that are appropriate. The Philippines has got a tremendously active civil society sector. And the key to its viability is tax deductibility for contributions. Now, this is a powerful instrument, tax deductibility. And if you give this instrument to the government, you're creating a government gatekeeper, and therefore you're creating either political implications or corruption implications to this process of who can get tax deductibility. So the Philippines basically delegated this to the civil society sector itself. It had to organize itself. It has to determine which new entrant has tax deductibility and which doesn't, and the government accepts the decision of the self-regulating civil society sector. Follow the Philippine example of self-regulation of civil society, because if you have government regulation, you will have problems. And the best answer is not to have no regulation, but the best answer is self-regulation, and the Philippines provides a great example. A final example of interesting, innovative institutions from the Global South comes from Korea. Basically, Korean civil society got fed up with corruption. Corruption was such an ingrained part of the way the Korean system worked. It was because so much of the Korean economy is controlled by the chaebol, by the large companies. And so there was such a cozy relationship between those large companies and the government. And this is just a recipe for insider corruption issues. And basically a consortium of NGOs got together and they created a scorecard, parliamentarian by parliamentarian, of who they thought was corrupt and who they thought was not corrupt. This was first instituted, I think, in the 1998 elections. It got a lot of publicity and it had a tremendous impact. Most of those politicians who they claimed were corrupt were not given party pre-selection for the next election. Those that stood, the vast majority did not get elected. So this was turned into a very powerful tool. I think it has dissipated somewhat. I think the energy has sort of gone out of it, and the anti-corruption fight has broadened beyond just the issue of which parliamentarian is corrupt and which is not. But again, the concept of a civil society scorecard for a parliamentarian disseminated through free media is very powerful.